I went to lunch with my best friend at the restaurant and caught my wife and her lover together. That scene destroyed me. My friend saw it and said, "Dude, go over there and do something." And so I went. I went like someone crossing a burned bridge, with no intention of coming back. I approached her with my heart pounding in my chest, and I said to her, coldly, looking straight into her eyes, as if I no longer recognized the face in front of me, "I hope you're having fun, because I want a divorce right now." She froze. Trembling, like a child caught red-handed, she mumbled some pathetic excuse about a work meeting, as if I had been born yesterday, as if his presence there, his hands too close, his knowing looks, could be explained by a spreadsheet. I knew. I knew it wasn't just that. I knew it by the way she looked away, by the way her throat went dry when I looked at her. And even with my blood boiling, a part of me died in silence there, in that restaurant, amidst laughter from other people's tables and still warm dishes. The part that believed in her. The part that believed in us. In the days that followed, she tried. She tried like someone trying to put out a fire with buckets of tears. She cried. She begged. She followed me to the car, sent me long messages like badly written novels, saying that it was all a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she felt alone. But anyone who cheats once knows exactly what they're doing. She chose. And now she wanted to convince me that it was a slip-up. That it was all a cry for attention. As if I hadn't spent years trying to be the ideal man for her, as if I hadn't swallowed my own pain in silence over so many early mornings. She only realized that she had lost me when I was too far away to be reached. When she realized that there was no more begging that could rewrite what she had destroyed. It's funny how betrayal has a smell. It has a sound. It has a temperature. It doesn't start with the act. It starts with the sudden distancing, with the automatic responses, with the eyes that no longer meet yours, with the hugs that last less than they should. I felt it. But I denied it. Because that's what love is, isn't it? Love is giving the benefit of the doubt even when all the evidence screams otherwise. Love is being the last one to let go of the rope, even with your hands already bleeding. I bled. And she didn't even notice. After that day at the restaurant, I changed. I changed my home, my routine, my outlook. I started sleeping on the side of the bed where she used to sleep, just to remind myself that she was no longer there. And at first, yes, it hurt. It hurt as if pieces of me were being ripped out with tweezers. I relived the scene at the restaurant in my dreams, woke up sweating, angry for having slept, for having dreamed, for still remembering the smell of her perfume on my shirt. But time, that silent ally, gradually put everything in its place. And while she was dissolving in regret, while the "please come back" came with flowers, letters, and promises, all I could see was the abyss that had opened between us. An abyss built by lies, by touches given in secret, by messages deleted before I got home. And the most curious thing was the reunion. That reunion. On a normal morning, one of those that life throws at you without warning. I was there, participating in a parent meeting at our son's school. Hair neat, shirt well ironed, calm. She entered the room with her shoulders hunched, her eyes searching for something that was no longer there. She saw me. And stopped. I continued. I sat down, greeted other parents, and smiled for real. It was the first time she had seen me smiling without her being the reason. Or rather, it was the first time she had seen me smiling since she stopped being the reason. And there, in the middle of a classroom, among plastic chairs and colorful posters made by children, she understood. She understood that she had lost me. Not because of the betrayal. But because of everything that happened afterwards. Because of the way she tried to justify the unjustifiable. Because of the cowardice of not having faced me with the truth when there was still time. Her gaze said it all. It was despair disguised as pride. It was longing trying to hide behind light makeup and a forced smile. She looked at me like someone watching a train leave the station without having bought a ticket. And me? I looked at her like someone watching the end of a film that no longer moves me. Because love also dies. It dies buried by lies, by omissions, by looks given to those who didn't deserve it. It dies when what was beautiful becomes a reason for shame. And in that moment, she finally saw the reflection of what she had caused. Not in screams, nor in revenge. But in my calm. In my peace. In my absence. I followed. And she stayed. She was trapped in trying to revive something she herself had killed. She tried to retrace her steps, recite memories, rebuild the past with sweet words that came too late. But that was another story. That was another path. And perhaps the worst punishment was this, knowing that, despite all the effort, all the desperate attempt to mend what had been torn, she would never again be part of my life. She would never again see my smile up close. She would never again have my affection, my body, my soul. Because certain things, when they break, don't make a sound. But silence, oh, silence weighs like 1,000 tons. And it is in this silence that she lives now. Trying to decipher exactly where she lost me. Trying to understand how I was able to move forward with such determination. She betrayed me thinking it would be just an adventure. I left and became the chapter she would most like to reread. But the book was closed. And the key, thrown away. But there is something she still doesn't know. Something that can change everything. A discovery that will turn her world upside down when she thinks everything is calm. And that's exactly when, the real story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make one thing very clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal, all the stories told are fictional, but based on real emotions and situations, with the sole purpose of showing how betrayal destroys homes, feelings and lives. Get ready now to dive into a narrative intense, shocking and unforgettable. Take a deep breath, and be ready to feel and before the weight of choices that cannot be undone. Good story. Gabriel has always been a man with a subtle presence, the kind who didn't need to raise his voice to be noticed. His calmness was almost a shield against the world, and perhaps that was what attracted Isabella so much, a woman who grew up surrounded by noise and haste. When they met, he was working as a marketing manager at a technology company, with a predictable routine that gave him a certain sense of security. Isabella, on the other hand, was a public relations officer for a multinational company and led a life that was balanced between events, spreadsheets, and impeccable makeup. Two different worlds that found a meeting point in the unexpected. The beginning was light, full of silent mutual admiration. He was enchanted by her intensity, by the way she expressed herself with her entire body when she spoke, while she was surprised by the serene way he viewed the chaos around him. It wasn't an explosive romance, the kind that burns everything around it, but a slow, careful, steady construction. A love that was molded to routine and that seemed made to last. Over time, their relationship turned into a relationship, and their relationship became a life together. They got married in a gray autumn, without any major ceremonies, just with close friends and a simple promise made in their eyes, to walk together. The apartment where they lived reflected the balance between the two. Gabriel's books and plants shared space with the vibrant paintings and modern pieces that Isabella chose at art and design fairs. There was a naturalness between them, as if each understood when the other needed silence, or a hug, or words. Even when the arguments came, which appeared from time to time as in any relationship, there was an ethic of respect that was never broken. They slept hugging each other, even on the days when pride insisted on keeping their faces turned in opposite directions. In short, they had something that few had the courage to build, a partnership based on listening and admiration. Gabriel was not a man with many friends, but there was one who was almost like a brother, Lucas, a companion since college. Confident and always present, Lucas knew every nuance of their marriage. He was also close to Isabella. He would visit their house naturally, have dinner with them, laugh at old jokes and give advice even without being asked. For Gabriel, Lucas was an extension of himself, someone he trusted without reservations. And this friendship, curiously, was never a problem for Isabella, who always treated him with affection, even when the three of them were together, and she would withdraw to give them space. In her professional life, Isabella was gaining prominence. Important projects, frequent trips, recognition. Her name began to be mentioned in decisive meetings, and little by little, she began to divide her attention more and more between home and commitments. Gabriel, on the other hand, remained in the same position, in the same company, with the same routine. He didn't mind. He liked the predictability, the feeling of being present, of being able to calmly prepare breakfast or organize the books on the shelf while Isabella was still finishing her makeup. He admired her deeply, was proud of her achievements, even though sometimes a silent emptiness would take over his chest when he found himself having dinner alone once again. On weekends, when they could breathe together, their complicity returned. They went to the movies, cooked together, and had friends over. She laughed at things that only he would say, and he was enchanted by her small gestures, how she danced barefoot in the kitchen, how she bit the cap of her pen when she was thinking, how she left notes in unexpected places with quotes from movies they both loved. There was no sign of distancing. Or maybe there was, but true love, when it is sincere, insists on not seeing what might hurt. Gabriel trusted. That was the thread that held everything together. A blind trust, almost childish, but genuine. And Isabella, even in her constant search for movement, for new things, for challenges, always seemed to come back to him with the same sparkle in her eyes. Their marriage had lasted 7 years. They had overcome difficult times, changes in plans, losses and triumphs. They had a 5-year-old son, Tomas, who slept with them on Sundays and asked difficult questions on Monday mornings. Gabriel was a devoted father, the kind who learns how to braid hair and whistle cartoon songs. He woke up early, prepared school snacks, and attended pedagogical meetings, even when Isabella couldn't go. He told her that everything was fine, that she was building something great, and that he was there to support her. And he really was. His days were marked by simple schedules: drop off his son, go to work, come back, prepare dinner, organize the house, read something, sleep. He repeated this cycle with serenity. He didn't feel inferior because of it. On the contrary, he felt that he was fulfilling a sacred role. Isabella, however, found herself in a constant spiral. Her demands increased, her contacts multiplied. Now she dined with executives from large companies, appeared in industry magazines, and had even been invited to speak at international events. Gabriel celebrated each achievement, made a point of showing pride, of recording everything, of telling his colleagues. But inside her, a restlessness grew. It wasn't a lack of love. It was something harder to name. It was as if stability began to seem static, as if the peace he offered was no longer a refuge and was slowly turning into boredom. Still, the displays of affection continued. Exchanging gifts, family trips, loving messages. Gabriel would wait for her awake on nights when she came home late. Sometimes she would arrive in silence, just resting her head on his chest and saying, "Hold me tight, today was hard." He would hug her, without asking questions. He never asked too many questions. He never suspected. He never raised suspicions. He believed that love, when it is true, sustains itself. And she, even carrying the weight of an increasingly hectic life, never stopped smiling when he sang out of tune in the shower or when he called her by old nicknames. They were there. They were still there. At Tomas's school, his parents were seen as role models. They were always present at presentations, meetings, and school events. They seemed to balance work and family with mastery. The teachers praised them. There was an aura of admiration surrounding the family. And for that very reason, no one saw what was happening between the lines. No one noticed the small changes in gestures, the averted glances, the prolonged silences. It was as if everything was still in place, but something essential was missing, invisible to the eyes but present in the heart. And it was during one of these school meetings, on a normal day, that everything began to change. Gabriel arrived alone, as usual, and sat at the back of the room. A little later, Isabella came in. She looked different. It wasn't her hair, or her clothes. It was her gaze. A gaze that was searching, that was probing. And when she saw Gabriel, she smiled the same smile as before. But he didn't smile back. He just nodded and turned his attention back to the papers in his hands. The meeting went on as usual. But there was something there, in the air, in the way he crossed his arms, in the way he no longer touched her with his eyes. She felt it. For the first time, she felt that he was no longer in the same place. On the way home, silence. The car drove slowly through the streets, and she looked out the window as if searching for something she couldn't name. Gabriel just drove. No music, no words, no demands. And in that silence, something began to unravel inside her. A restlessness that mixed with fear. As if, finally, she was feeling what he had felt for so long without ever showing it. It was absence. His absence within her gaze. And maybe it was too late. Or maybe not. That night, she watched him from afar. Gabriel was organizing Tomas' toys, folding a small t-shirt and arranging his books. His gestures were simple, but they had a delicacy that always went unnoticed. She realized how much he carried. How much love there was in each small gesture. And for the first time in years, she was afraid of losing him. Not because of a fight, or a crisis. But because he was already leaving, even though he was there. And all of this happened before any revelation, before any secrets were discovered. Before the story really began to unfold. And it was only the beginning. Because there was something that would change everything. Something that Gabriel didn't know yet. Something that Isabella tried, in vain, to hide even from herself. Something that was about to come to light, and change both of their lives forever. In the weeks that followed that silent meeting at school, something imperceptible began to change in the dynamics between Gabriel and Isabella. He didn't change his routines, he didn't stop making breakfast, responding kindly, participating in activities with Tomas, but there was a thick layer of distance between them that Isabella felt like a glass wall. She could see everything, but could no longer touch it. She tried to fill the gaps with old words and gestures, but Gabriel always seemed to be 2 steps ahead, not in an arrogant or punitive way, but as if he had simply given up on waiting. This emotional absence was an echo inside her, reverberating in the corners of what had once been certain. The uneasiness that had once been murky now took shape, fear. Fear that he was leaving not with suitcases or speeches, but with his heart, with his presence, with everything that made him hers. Isabella began to notice details that had never bothered her before. The way he dressed more carefully, how he was more focused in conversations with other people, how he smiled spontaneously even when she wasn't around. At school meetings, in quick conversations with other children's parents, there was a lightness about him that she no longer recognized, because it was no longer hers. And it was during this time, between the growing guilt and the desperation to regain control, that she began to delve into herself. She reread old letters, opened photo albums, watched short videos on her cell phone where he appeared laughing at some silly joke. It all seemed to have happened in another life, as if they were characters in a movie that had no sequel. She tried, in her own way, to recreate the moments. She began to send unexpected messages during the day, sent photos of them together with melancholic captions, prepared dishes that he liked. But it all paled in comparison to Gabriel's calm silence. Lucas, always present, noticed the weight in his friend's eyes, but said nothing. He preferred to be a shelter rather than a question. And Gabriel didn't offer any answers either. He was quiet, like someone who senses something but doesn't want to see it yet. An end doesn't come with sirens. It arrives slowly, like mist. But Gabriel, although still in the same home, had already retreated to an inner place where only he, his son and the secret desire to start over existed, far from the pain he couldn't name, but that was already consuming him inside. Isabella became even more involved in her work. The nights grew longer, the events became more frequent, and the dinners at home became increasingly silent. She said she was tired, she used the right words, the right kisses, but there was an anxiety in her eyes that didn't match her speech. Gabriel understood, of course he understood. But he didn't confront her. He had learned that confronting someone who wants to lie only accelerates their downfall. He watched, silently, as the distance became routine, the absence became the rule. He knew, deep down inside, that something was wrong. But he refused to accuse. Sometimes, those who love choose not to know. One Saturday night, while Tomas was sleeping and the house was filled with the low sound of instrumental music, Isabella approached him with a glass of wine and tried to start a light conversation. She talked about a new exhibition, about a possible invitation to an event abroad. Gabriel listened, nodded, and complimented her. But his eyes were elsewhere. She smiled, touched his shoulder with her fingertips, and asked if he was okay. He said yes, but his voice had the exact tone of someone who had already said goodbye inside. That night, Isabella took a long time to fall asleep. She turned over and tried to pull him closer, but he was already asleep. Or pretending to be asleep. And that silence was the first of many. Over time, weekends began to be shared with more people. Planned visits, meetings with mutual friends, outings with Tomas. Lucas, of course, was present at almost all of these moments. But it was different. Gabriel was becoming more and more centered, more calm. And that bothered Isabella deeply. There was a peace in him that became unbearable. She tried to talk to Lucas, jokingly, asking if Gabriel was acting strangely. Lucas smiled vaguely, as if he knew more than he was saying, and replied that perhaps Gabriel was just tired. But Isabella knew it wasn't tiredness. It was distance. A distance that she hadn't asked for, but that she had caused. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that everything really started to change. Gabriel had left work early to have lunch with Lucas. Something simple, a break from the routine. Isabella, coincidentally, was also nearby. He had an upcoming meeting and decided to have a snack first. The restaurant was small, discreet, frequented by professionals looking for silence. When she walked in, Isabella didn't see Gabriel right away. But he did. And he saw much more than he expected. There, at a table far away, was she. Sitting across from a man he didn't know. She was laughing differently. He touched his glass with his fingers in a way he knew well. A way I only used when I wanted to be noticed. Time stood still. Lucas, who was with Gabriel, noticed his fixed gaze, turned around and understood immediately. He muttered, in a serious tone, "Dude, go over there and do something." Gabriel hesitated for a second. But something inside him, which could no longer bear the silence, rose up. She stood up and walked with firm steps. The restaurant, with its soft lights and muffled voices, grew denser with each step. She reached the table. She saw him and, for a moment, it seemed as if the world was collapsing in slow motion. The man in front of her stiffened. Gabriel, without changing his tone of voice, simply said, "I hope you're having fun, because I want a divorce right now." Isabella turned pale. She tried to smile, tried to minimize it, mumbled something about a business meeting. But Gabriel's gaze didn't seek explanations. It was clear, empty, and perhaps for that reason, more cutting than any shout. She still tried to get up, to touch his arm, but he was already turning his back. Lucas was waiting for him at the exit. They walked in silence. There were no words of comfort. Because there was no new pain there. There was only the confirmation of an old pain. Gabriel did not cry. He did not shout. He just took a deep breath. For the first time, he was breathing without the weight of pretending. Isabella, still in the restaurant, tried to understand what had happened. Her hands were shaking. The other man stood up embarrassed, trying to offer some help, but she no longer listened to him. Her world had collapsed with a single sentence. And the worst thing was not the sentence. It was the way he said it. With a coldness she had never known. A coldness that was not revenge, but an end. An end that she herself built, brick by brick. In the following days, she tried to contact him. She sent messages, called, looked for Lucas. She tried to justify, minimize, change the subject. But nothing worked. Gabriel didn't respond. Not with words. Not with gestures. Only with absence. And in that emptiness, she began to feel something she had never felt before, real regret. Not the kind of regret that seeks forgiveness, but the kind that understands that forgiveness may never come. Gabriel was now beginning to rewrite his routine. He rediscovered the pleasure of doing things for himself. He took Tomas to the park more often, read more, laughed more. His gaze was different. And Isabella, watching from a distance, saw this new man emerge like an open wound in her soul. I couldn't touch him, I couldn't go back. And it was in this new version of him that her true punishment lay. Realizing that the man who was once hers now existed without her. Better, stronger, lighter. And even in the face of all the pain, Gabriel knew he hadn't seen everything yet. Because there was something. A secret kept. Something he didn't know yet, but that would completely change the way he saw everything he had lived. And the way he would look at Isabella for the last time. It was late afternoon when Gabriel parked the car in front of the school to pick up Tomas. The sun was hiding behind the heavy clouds and the air carried a silence that anticipated something that had not yet revealed itself. He was calmer than in the previous days, not because the pain had gone away, but because he had learned to live with it without letting it crush him. The divorce was already underway, and he made a point of keeping the dialogue with Isabella strictly functional, focused on matters concerning their son, without leaving room for revisiting the past or giving in to fragile nostalgia. Isabella, on the other hand, seemed increasingly shaken by his indifference. She sent him spaced messages, always starting with some excuse to deal with practical matters, but which invariably ended with empty phrases trying to pull him back to something she herself had thrown away. Gabriel didn't respond more than necessary. He was tired. Tired of looking back and not finding anything that could save him from ruin. That afternoon, when Tomas got into the car, he was quieter than usual. Gabriel noticed his lowered gaze, his fingers intertwined in his lap, his breath held. He asked if everything was okay, and the boy responded with an unconvincing nod. On the way back, his son blurted out the question like someone dropping a bomb without knowing it was set. He said that his mother had cried at the parent-teacher meeting the week before, when she saw him talking to the teacher, and that later, at home, she had said confusing things about bad choices and old fears. Gabriel felt his stomach churn. He knew that Isabella was struggling with her own regret, but he had no idea that she was leaving traces in her conversations with his son. He asked Tomas not to worry, that sometimes adults get confused and need time to sort out their feelings, and that he could trust that everything would be okay. The next day, when he dropped Tomas off at school, he was surprised by a staff member who approached him discreetly in the parking lot. She seemed nervous, her eyes avoiding his. She said she needed to talk, that there was something important, something he might want to know. Gabriel remained motionless. The staff member, after hesitating for seconds that seemed like minutes, told him that a few weeks ago Isabella had been seen leaving school with a man on a Saturday morning. According to her, the man seemed uncomfortable, looked around suspiciously, and the two went to the back parking lot, where they remained for more than 40 minutes in her car. She said she didn't want to get involved in anyone's life, but that, as the mother of a student and Gabriel's colleague at school meetings, she thought it was unfair to keep the matter quiet. Gabriel thanked him, but said nothing. He returned to the car as if carrying an invisible weight. It hurt not because it was news, but because it was confirmation. And confirmations, no matter how expected, always cut deep. That night, after Tomas went to sleep, he went to the couple's old memory box, stored in the closet, where there were letters, photos and small sentimental objects. Inside, among papers yellowed by time, he found an envelope he didn't recognize. It was in Isabella's handwriting, but it was sealed. It was a letter. Dated 2 years ago. He opened it. Read it. And everything fell apart. The letter began with sweet, almost naive words, but gradually took on a confessional tone. Isabella described a difficult time she was going through emotionally. She said she felt lost, questioning her choices, searching for a place where she could feel alive again. She revealed that, during that time, she had gotten closer to someone who, at the time, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. But what made Gabriel lose his breath was the name that appeared between the final lines, Lucas. She wrote with regret, saying that she knew she would never have the courage to tell him, but that she needed to write to release the weight of her guilt. That everything happened so quickly, that it was confusing, that she tried to resist, but that she had crossed a line. That Lucas kissed her one night when Gabriel was away on business, and that, even knowing how unforgivable that was, she couldn't completely pull away. The letter ended with a request for forgiveness that was never sent. Gabriel read it once, twice, 3 times. He couldn't breathe. It was as if the world around him had frozen. It wasn't just Isabella's betrayal. It was Lucas. His best friend. His soul brother. The only person with whom he had shared all his anguish, fears, and dreams. The man who held his hand when his father died. Who had been by his side on every birthday, in every achievement. That revelation shattered everything he believed in. Because the betrayal of a love, however painful, is still something to be expected on the unstable ground of desire. But the betrayal of a true friendship is a blow to the spine. It is the breaking of a silent code, of an unwritten pact. The anger came next. First came the emptiness. The feeling of floating in a sea with no ground. Then, the trembling in his hands. The urge to scream, to punch something, to wake up the whole world and tell it was all a lie. But he didn't scream. He didn't destroy anything. He sat down. He picked up his cell phone. He looked for Lucas's number. He called. He rang 4 times. On the 5th, he answered. Lucas's voice came softly, unconcerned. Gabriel went straight to the point, without hesitation. He asked if he remembered the night he was alone while he was traveling. The silence on the other end was immediate. Long. Almost deafening. Then, Lucas let out a sigh that Gabriel would never forget. A sound somewhere between relief and surrender. He said he wanted to tell her. That he felt like crap every day since then. That it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, that it would never happen again. That Isabella had pulled away afterward, that she had cried, that she had asked him to never touch her again. Gabriel listened to everything without saying a word. Until, finally, he spoke. And his voice was firm, but filled with an old pain that now unfolded in layers. He said he never wanted to see her again. That the only thing that existed between them now was silence. And that, if there had ever been true friendship, it had died the moment Lucas decided to cross that line. Lucas tried to justify himself, said he hated himself inside, that he didn't know how he had allowed that to happen. Gabriel hung up. Isabella didn't hear about the letter that day. Or the next day. Gabriel needed to think. He needed to decide what to do with that open wound. But life didn't give him much time. 2 days later, when he was picking up Tomas, he ran into Isabella at the school gate. She tried to smile. He didn't smile. He asked them to talk in private. They went to the car. Sitting face to face, without distractions, he took the letter out of his pocket. He handed it to her. He didn't say anything. He just watched as she opened it, read it, and lost the color in her face. When she finished, she tried to speak, but he interrupted her with his hand. He said he understood everything now. That he finally understood the reason for her distancing herself, her restless gaze, her guilt disguised in forced affection. He said he didn't hate her. Because hatred required a bond he no longer had. What he felt was grief. And that, more than anything, he felt sorry for Tomas, for having to grow up knowing that his parents had lost their way due to choices that didn't need to be made. Isabella cried in silence. She didn't apologize. She didn't try to justify it. She just whispered that she had destroyed the only real thing she had in life. And there, on the seat of that car, they both understood that there was no going back. But what Gabriel didn't know yet was that the hole was deeper. Much deeper. Because there was something hidden in that story that neither of them had faced yet. A piece of the puzzle that, when fitted together, would completely change the outcome of this journey. And that detail, that secret, was about to come to light, and with it, the last masks would fall. The rain began to fall slowly as Gabriel drove through the empty streets, the drops on the windshield creating patterns that seemed to speak to what was happening inside him. The revelation of the letter had become a breaking point that went far beyond pain. It was as if everything had finally fallen into place, every gesture that had been avoided, every prolonged silence, every absence masked with excuses that now seemed ridiculous. Isabella's betrayal of Lucas, his lifelong friend, was not only a breach of trust, it was an implosion of his very sense of belonging. The feeling that for years he had been the last to know a story that everyone around him had perhaps already intuited was eroding what little remained of the emotional structure he was trying to keep together. The car drove to a side street, where he stopped in front of a small cafe where he and Isabella used to go in the early years of their marriage. There was nothing nostalgic about the gesture. He just needed to stop. Think. Breathe. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the stifling heat contrasted with the storm outside. He sat at a table in the corner, ordered a short espresso, and watched people come and go, oblivious to everything. His mind, although exhausted, was still working at an absurd speed. He thought about Tomas. About how he would protect his son from all of this. About how he would maintain the balance between the end of a marriage and the emotional integrity of a child who had nothing to do with the mistakes of the adults around him. That was the focus now. The son. The reconstruction. Because of what existed between him and Isabella, only the necessary remained, responsibilities. Their affection had been crushed by the neglect and by her conscious choice to cross boundaries. That night, when he got home, he found a white envelope under the door. There was no sender, just his name written by hand, in the handwriting of someone trying to be firm and failing. He opened it slowly. Inside, there was only one sheet of paper, folded into 4 parts. He recognized Lucas's handwriting. He didn't need to read it to know that it was a last attempt. And yet he read it anyway. It was a more elaborate request for forgiveness, full of shared memories, trying to explain the inexplicable with an emotional logic that only made sense to someone who had betrayed him. Lucas spoke of impulses, of need, of confusion, but in the end, he admitted what Gabriel already knew, that had not been an isolated mistake, nor a moment of weakness. It had been a choice. And choices have consequences. He folded the letter without anger, without haste, and threw it into the back of a drawer that he did not intend to open again. 2 days later, Isabella came to him. She said she needed to talk to him, not about the past, but about something urgent. Gabriel was reluctant. He didn't want any more pointless conversations. There was no more reconciliation to be sought. But he accepted, perhaps out of respect for what they had experienced, or perhaps because there was still a spark of curiosity in the face of everything that had been revealed. They arranged to meet in a secluded park, a public but quiet place. He arrived punctually, as he always did. She was already there, sitting on a stone bench, her eyes fixed on the ground and her shoulders hunched. When she saw him approaching, she immediately stood up, but she didn't smile. There was an expression on her face of tiredness mixed with something harder to name. Fear, perhaps. Or shame. Bluntly, she told him there was something he needed to know. Something she had been keeping since the day it all happened, since the first time she crossed the line. Gabriel crossed his arms, kept his gaze steady, waiting for her to continue. Isabella took a deep breath, walked a few steps, as if looking for space between words, and then stopped. She said that Lucas hadn't simply appeared in her life as an occasional mistake. That they had been exchanging messages for months, long before the kiss that the letter revealed. That they had met a few times, yes, but that she had always tried to rationalize it as friendship, even when her whole body screamed otherwise. Gabriel just listened to her, like someone watching a building collapse for the 1000th time. And then, she stopped. She looked at him with teary eyes, and murmured something that he didn't immediately understand. She said that the night Lucas was at her house, the same night he had gone away, wasn't just a moment of impulse. She said that that night she discovered something she had never had the courage to share. Gabriel frowned, not understanding. Isabella hesitated, her lips trembling, and then finally said that night, when she saw Lucas in the apartment, when she saw him with Tomas in his arms, playing on the living room floor while she made coffee, something inside her collapsed. She was certain, then and there, that her feelings for Lucas were older than she imagined. That they had been nurtured in silence, by hidden glances during dinners, by jokes exchanged at family events, by conversations that, little by little, stopped being innocent. She said she wasn't confessing to ease her guilt, but because there was more. Something Gabriel didn't know. Something that would change everything. And then she said. She said she had taken a test. An exam, a while back. That she kept the results without the courage to open them. That she went to the doctor alone. That she stayed awake nights, blaming herself, tormenting herself, wondering if she should tell him. Gabriel said nothing. The silence between them was almost physical. Isabella opened her bag, took out a crumpled envelope. She handed it to him. She said it was there. That he could read it. He took the paper. He opened it. And there, in cold letters, were the words that froze his world: parental genetic compatibility test. The result said there was 0% compatibility between him and Tomas. For a moment, Gabriel didn't understand. He read it again. 3 times. His heart raced. His face turned pale. His throat went dry. When he looked up, Isabella was already crying. He said he didn't know. That he only found out later. That it wasn't certain when it all happened. That he had suspected, that he had tried to deny it, that he had hoped time would erase it. But time doesn't erase what was done. He said that when he found out, he decided not to tell, afraid of destroying everything. And now, with everything already destroyed, there was no point in hiding it anymore. Gabriel stood up and took a few steps away. It was as if the ground was collapsing beneath his feet. This was bigger than anything he had faced until then. Tomas was not his biological son. The boy he had raised with all his love and care did not carry his blood. A devastating emptiness took over his chest. It was not anger, it was not hate, it was a pain that had no name, that tore at him silently. Isabella tried to get closer, tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away. He said he needed to be alone. That he needed to think. That he no longer knew what was real. And he walked away, without looking back. He walked aimlessly for hours, until night completely enveloped him. The rain started again, fine, cold, indifferent. And he kept going, trying to pick up the pieces of a life that suddenly seemed to have been built on sand. Each step was an effort not to collapse. Each memory of Tomas tore him apart. Because, despite everything, he was his son. The boy he taught to ride a bike, who fell asleep on his chest countless nights, who called him father with the purest truth. But now, even that was in doubt. And it was with this dilemma that he would have to live, to continue loving someone who was not his by nature, but who was completely his by choice. That night, when he got home, he locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat on the living room floor. The place where he had played with Tomas so many times. The memories came in waves, and with them, the tears he had tried to hold back for so long. The pain was not only due to the betrayal, but also due to the loss of his identity. Everything he had believed he had built now seemed like a cruel illusion. And yet, deep in his chest, there was a strange, unexpected seed that pulsed among the rubble: love. Because, despite everything, true love does not depend on blood. It depends on surrender. And Gabriel knew that, no matter how much that truth tore him apart, he would never stop loving Tomas. But as for Isabella, she had gone too far. And there was no turning back. What he would do from that moment on would change everything. And what she would finally feel would be the true weight of having lost not only a husband, but the only man who had loved her completely. The next morning, the sky seemed gray inside, as if the weather outside had decided to imitate the opacity that now inhabited Gabriel. The world was moving, but he moved slowly, like someone walking underwater. His eyes burned not only from the exhaustion of a sleepless night, but from a deep pain that could not be healed with rest. Every corner of the house reminded him of moments that now twisted inside him, no longer as comfortable memories, but as subtle knives. The glass of milk forgotten in the sink, the small children's backpack hanging on the hook in the entrance, the sneakers left in the corner of the living room, the photo frame with the smiling image of three people who, at that point, represented an unanswered enigma. He no longer cried. Not because the pain had stopped, but because the pain had already overflowed so much that it now flowed in another way, in the form of silence, of introspection, of a weight on his shoulders that not all the apologies in the world could alleviate. At work, he tried to stay focused. But his eyes flickered on the screen and his thoughts, in a constant loop, returned to the revelation. The words, 0% compatibility, echoed with a scientific coldness that contrasted violently with the warmth of his memories. It was as if something had been ripped from him without anesthesia, as if all along he had believed in a reflection that had never existed. And yet, as cruel as this truth was, what deeply confused him was the love he still felt for Tomas. There was no resentment, no anger, when he thought of his son. Only tenderness. It was a pure, non-negotiable feeling, and that tore him apart even more. Because now this love needed to exist within a new agreement with reality. Tomas was not his biological son, but he was, in all that mattered, his son through and through. And this placed him before a moral dilemma that crushed him. In the following days, Gabriel distanced himself from everyone. He cancelled appointments, avoided meetings, didn't respond to messages from friends, much less from Isabella. He needed time. Space. An inner space where he could reorganize his feelings and decide how to move forward without further hurting what had already been torn apart. But Tomas couldn't wait. The boy felt it. He noticed something different in his father's gestures. Even though he was small, he was sensitive enough to notice that hugs were longer, that his eyes lingered longer on him, that words were filled with an almost desperate tenderness. One of those nights, while they were playing with blocks on the living room floor, Tomas asked with the cruel naturalness of children, "Dad, why do you look sad even when you smile?" Gabriel tried to hide it. He said he was tired. That adults sometimes have difficult days. But the question tore him apart. Because he knew that, at that moment, it was no longer possible to hide it. The truth was in every gesture, in every silence, in every attempt to pretend that the ground was still solid. And then he began to think about the possibility of telling the boy. Not to the boy, not yet. But to someone. Someone who could help organize the scattered pieces. He tried to seek counseling, called a therapist recommended by a colleague, and scheduled a session. In the office, he said little. The psychologist observed him carefully, but Gabriel still didn't know where to start. How could he explain that he felt betrayed and like a father at the same time? How could he verbalize the confusion of feeling deep love and unbearable pain over the same situation? The therapist simply said that he needed to accept that fatherhood is an act of love, not just a genetic inheritance. That the suffering came from the breaking of an expectation and that, with time, the new reality would become less painful. But Gabriel knew that it wasn't just about accepting. It was about deciding. Deciding whether he would continue to be that boy's father with the same dedication or whether he would allow his blood to speak louder than everything they had ever experienced together. Meanwhile, Isabella was drowning in futile attempts to get closer. She sent messages almost daily. Some short, others long, letters disguised as digital texts. Sometimes she asked for forgiveness, sometimes she said she understood if he never wanted to see her again, but she insisted that Tomas needed him. Gabriel didn't answer. She didn't know how. She still didn't have the strength. Her world seemed to be falling apart from the outside in, and she was trying, with what little she had left, to hold the pieces together. But everything was slipping away. Work began to fail, deadlines piled up, and the trust of her colleagues was eroding. She, who had always been admired for her firm posture and striking presence, now wandered the halls like a ghost of herself. She knew she had lost the respect not only of the man who loved her the most, but also of herself. Because living with regret is living with the shadow of all the decisions that can no longer be undone. It was then that, one random afternoon, Gabriel received a call from the school. It was the principal. Thomas had been involved in a fight. Nothing serious, but his behavior had changed. He was more aggressive, more withdrawn. He drew sad pictures, avoided eye contact, and said disjointed phrases like, "My father is going to disappear," or, "I belong to no one." Gabriel's world fell apart again. He realized that his silence, however necessary, was starting to cost him dearly for someone who was not to blame for anything. It was time to act. He had to take a step, however painful it might be. The next morning, he went to school and asked to speak to Tomas in the coordination office. The boy ran to him and threw himself into his lap with a strength that hurt. Gabriel held that small body so tightly that it seemed like he wanted to glue all the broken pieces back together. He said he loved him. That he would never leave. That no matter what happened between the adults, he would always be there. And there, in that room lit by old windows, he made the most difficult and true promise of his life. That he would be Tomas' father until the last day of his life. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. Because love is not measured in cells, but in gestures. In the days that followed, Gabriel began an internal process of reconstruction. He began to rediscover small pleasures, to allow himself to smile without guilt, to open spaces for new possibilities. It was still too early to think about romantic beginnings, but it was not impossible to imagine a life in which the past did not determine every step. It was then, one Saturday afternoon, when he took Tomas to a bookstore, that he met Laura. A simple, soft-spoken woman who approached him to help the boy reach a book from the highest shelf. Her gaze had a rare sweetness, devoid of intentions, and that touched him in an unexpected way. They talked for a few minutes, exchanged names, restrained smiles, and went their separate ways. But something about that encounter remained. A subtle spark that was unhurried, but that warmed something inside him. Isabella found out a few days later, by chance. A mutual friend had seen Gabriel with a woman and her son, laughing in a coffee shop. He described the scene as something like, beautiful, true. And that crushed her. Not because of jealousy, but because of a sadness that no longer had anywhere to hide. Because there was proof that she had truly lost him. Not to another woman, but to a new version of himself. A version that she had helped destroy and that would never be hers again. In the silence of her own solitude, Isabella began to look back at her life with eyes she had never used before. She saw the places where she had made mistakes, the moments when she could have chosen differently, the signs she had ignored. She faced the weight of it all. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to offer. Only the naked truth that she was the only one responsible for losing the man who had loved her like no one else ever would. And in that emptiness, she understood what it meant to lose everything. Gabriel was now taking firm steps. Little by little, he was allowing the world to touch him again. Not like before, but with a different awareness. I knew that I would still have difficult days, unanswered questions, nights when my memory would weigh too much. But I also knew that the love I had for Tomas was his anchor. And that, perhaps, with time, the smile of that woman with calm eyes would become something more. What he didn't know yet, but was already beginning to feel, was that life, even after being shattered, could indeed be rebuilt. But not with the same pieces. With new choices, new paths, and a strength that only arises after the abyss. And what was to come, finally, would bring not only closure, but a transformation. Autumn was advancing with its dry leaves scattered on the sidewalks, and the cutting wind was already beginning to take over the mornings, but, inside Gabriel, what was rising was not cold, it was a silent reconstruction. He had decided, with his heart emptied of the old illusion, that the past would no longer be his point of return, but rather the starting point for a new way of living. The emotional chaos caused by the revelation of the DNA test still weighed heavily, it is true, but he no longer carried it as an anchor but as a scar that, so deep, reminded him daily of his ability to survive. The love for Tomas, which many would believe had been shaken, was in fact more solid than ever. It was a love reaffirmed not by obligation, but by daily choice. Gabriel knew, clearly and serenely, that being a father was more than what ran through his veins, it was what ran through the time shared, the fears protected, the sleepless nights, the hands held in silence in the most difficult moments. Life went on with a different intensity. Mornings with Tomas were now precious rituals. The boy, despite his young age, understood and practiced the power of a hug, the relief of a silly game in the middle of a tense day, the security of a firm look telling him that everything was going to be okay, even if nothing was. Gabriel, lighter, began to see the world with eyes attentive to the details that had previously escaped him amid the rush of routine, the sound of water in the shower, the sound of the wind in the trees, the way his son would rest his head on his shoulder as he fell asleep on the couch. These simple details reminded him of what really mattered. And perhaps for this reason, he gradually allowed himself to make room for new connections. Laura, the woman he had met by chance at the bookstore, began to appear more frequently in the small encounters of life. First, casual encounters, then arranged coffees, long conversations about books, trips they had not taken, pains they did not easily confess. She did not ask about Isabella. She did not insist on knowing more than he was willing to offer. There was a silent maturity about her that captivated him. Laura knew how to listen, and this, for Gabriel, was a new way of being loved, without rushing, without demands, without thorns. On a cold Sunday afternoon, she accompanied him and Tomas to a planetarium. The boy loved it. He laughed out loud, held their hands with the confidence of someone who feels safe. And in that simple and powerful gesture, Gabriel saw a real possibility. Not of replacing the past, but of building a parallel, sincere story, free of lies. Meanwhile, Isabella was immersed in a process of mourning. It wasn't just mourning the end of her marriage, it was mourning the woman she had stopped being. She now lived in a small, rented apartment with less furniture and more silence. Her days were marked by absences, the absence of Tomas' laughter when she woke up, the sound of Gabriel's keys in the door at the end of the day, his scent on the pillow next to her. The emptiness materialized in a brutal way, in small details that she had previously ignored. She began to go to therapy, to write letters that she had not sent, to search within herself for some explanation that went beyond the mistake. She wanted, more than to be forgiven, to be able to forgive herself one day. But this forgiveness was slow, difficult, almost unattainable. And the guilt ate away at her every time she heard her son talk about his father with a gleam in his eyes that she knew she no longer deserved. One late afternoon, Isabella called. Not to try to get back together, nor to cry about what could no longer be fixed. She called because she wanted to talk about Tomas. Gabriel answered after long seconds of hesitation. They arranged to meet in an open park, like the old ones, but now surrounded by an irreversible emotional distance. She arrived first, waited sitting on a bench, looking at the bare branches of the trees. When he approached, she stood up. Her face bore the marks of fatigue that could not be hidden with makeup. Gabriel maintained his calm posture, but his gaze was direct, firm, as if he no longer had anyone to prove anything to. Isabella spoke slowly. She said she wanted to ask something. She wanted to know if he would allow her to get closer to Tomas in a more structured way, with the help of a child therapist, someone who would accompany them in this process. Gabriel listened to everything in silence, but his mind traveled to the night when everything came to light, to the moment when she gave him the letter and broke everything in half. Still, he did not respond with resentment. He said that, for Tomas' sake, he was willing to talk to the therapist, to create a possible path. But that any step from then on would be based on truth. Without mincing words, without attempts at manipulation. Isabella nodded, murmuring that she understood. And in that meeting, so full of unsaid things, there was a kind of silent closure. Not a reconciliation, but an end to the veiled war that had been waged since the separation. A few days later, while walking with Tomas, Gabriel noticed something new. The boy was running ahead, laughing, and when he turned to call him, his eyes met Laura's, who was watching him from afar, with an expression of sincere affection. That touched him deeply. Her presence was no longer just a novelty. It was a reality that was approaching, with calm but firm steps. That night, after putting Tomas to bed, Gabriel invited Laura to dinner at his house. Nothing grand. Just the two of them, a bottle of wine and the need to talk more deeply. He talked about his pains, his guilt, the dilemmas he still carried. Laura listened to him without interrupting. When he answered, he said that he was not looking for someone perfect, but someone honest with what he felt. He said that he saw in him a man in reconstruction, and that this was more beautiful than any well-polished armor. Gabriel smiled. A new smile. A smile that he himself had not seen for a long time. Meanwhile, the relationship between him and Tomas was growing stronger on another level. One weekend, they decided to camp in the backyard, set up a makeshift tent, make s'mores in the oven, and tell each other made-up stories. During the early hours of the morning, when the boy fell asleep on his chest, Gabriel felt something he couldn't quite name, but it felt like redemption. Not with Isabella. Not with the past. But with himself. It was as if, by moving forward, he was finding himself for the first time. This new man that Laura admired, that Tomas loved, that his friends were beginning to recognize again, was a reflection of the pain he had been through, but, above all, it was the result of the courage to not let himself sink. Isabella, in turn, began to write a letter to Tomas. A letter that he would read one day, when he was older. Not as a way to justify her mistakes, but as a request for forgiveness with honest words. She said that she had been a coward, that she had lost herself, that she had not known how to value what she had. And that, even if he did not understand now, one day perhaps he would forgive her. She ended by saying that she loved him more than anything, but that she knew that love, sometimes, was not enough to stop the pain, and that she hoped he would never have to learn this the hard way. From then on, everything started to fall into place. Gabriel, more confident, resumed old plans. He started a writing course, something he had always wanted to do. He reorganized his finances, sold his old house and moved to a new, smaller, more comfortable apartment, just for him and Tomas. Laura started visiting them frequently, but without invading. She knew how to wait. And he knew that, with her, everything was light. It was in this scenario of starting over that Gabriel finally understood that, sometimes, things need to fall apart completely so that they can be truly rebuilt. And what would come next, he still didn't know. But he was no longer afraid. Because now I was walking with my head held high, without carrying ghosts, only memories. And, finally, with space inside me for a new story. A story that, this time, would not begin with empty promises, but with conscious choices. Time followed its course with the relentless naturalness of someone who waits for no one. Spring arrived with its shy flowers sprouting among the dry branches of winter, and life around them seemed to blossom with it, but inside Gabriel, the process was deeper, slower, and yet firm. The relationship with Tomas had become a fortress built on genuine love and real presence, and there was no longer room for doubt. They belonged to each other by choice, by emotional bond, by all the little details that make up a shared life. Gabriel no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. That boy was his son, period. Every day, the complicity between the two grew. Tomas laughed more, slept better, spoke enthusiastically about the small achievements at school, and Gabriel knew that he was managing, with immense effort, to preserve something fundamental in him, the lightness of childhood, even in the face of a world that had collapsed around him. The relationship with Laura blossomed naturally. She didn't invade, she didn't demand anything, she just walked alongside. Over time, her presence stopped being just pleasant and became necessary. Someone with whom he could share not only the good days, but the anxieties that still arose in the quietest of nights. Laura understood. She herself had scars, fears, traumas. Maybe that's why the two of them fit together so organically, without rushing, without promises. A mature relationship, based on listening, in fact, on mutual care. And it was on a normal Sunday, when he saw the two of them together cooking something simple in the kitchen, she cutting vegetables while Tomas excitedly talked about a science project, that Gabriel realized he had found peace. Not the false peace of the first years of marriage, when everything seemed too perfect to be true, but the real peace that comes when you go through pain and still choose to keep loving. On the other hand, Isabella was going through a different process. The forced separation from Tomas, although partially compensated by the visits guided by the therapist, became the most painful punishment of all. The boy did not reject her, but he looked at her with a reserve that she had never known. Their conversations were short, their hugs restrained, and no matter how much she tried to restore the connection, there was something broken there that neither time nor apologies seemed capable of fixing. Isabella immersed herself in deep reflections, began to write daily in a notebook that she called her regret diary, where she recorded everything she learned from her destruction. There she discovered that betrayal does not begin with the act, but with the neglect of details, the refusal to face the voids, the cowardice of not talking about what hurts. And by admitting this to herself, she understood that her punishment was not the end of her marriage, nor the full-time absence of her son, but the constant awareness that she was the architect of her own ruin. One day, she decided to look for Lucas. Not with the intention of reliving anything, but to end the cycle. She found him in a small, secluded bar, where he seemed to have aged 10 years in just a few months. He was haggard, with deep circles under his eyes and a lost look in his eyes. When he saw her, he tried to smile, but the smile didn't go beyond an attempt. They talked for minutes that seemed like hours. Isabella was direct. She said she didn't hate him, but she didn't forgive him either. That the two of them had destroyed not just a man, but an entire story. Lucas, with his head down, said he regretted it every day since then. He said he had lost everything, friends, trust, opportunities. And that the worst of all was knowing that he had destroyed the only true bond he had ever had with someone outside of his family. When she got up to leave, he asked her for just one thing, that she not stop trying to rebuild herself. And for the first time in a long time, she cried. Not because of the losses, but because of the clarity of knowing that she had to start over from scratch, with no guarantees, no going back. Gabriel continued writing. He published chronicles on a blog that began to gain loyal readers. He spoke about fatherhood, about rebuilding, about how love can be born even after devastation. His words touched other men, other women, people who had gone through similar pain and didn't know where to anchor their own hearts. He received messages of gratitude, stories from people who, like him, had survived what seemed impossible. And there he found another purpose. Pain would not be just a memory, but an instrument of healing. He would use what he had experienced to illuminate the paths of others. One ordinary afternoon, Tomas came home from school with a drawing in his hands. He showed it to his father with pride. It was a self-portrait, him, with a man with wide arms at his side, and a woman in a blue dress behind them. Gabriel asked who they were. Tomas answered naturally, "It's me, you and Laura. We're a team." Gabriel couldn't contain his emotional smile. That was it. They were becoming a new family. Not in the traditional way, but something more real, more resilient. Years later, Tomas grew up with clarity about everything. Gabriel never hid the truth, but he never allowed it to be a burden either. When the time came, he explained it with affection, maturity, and respect. And Tomas, now a teenager, said something that Gabriel would never forget: "Dad, you taught me everything about love and truth. I don't care what a piece of paper says. What matters to me is who was here the whole time." And there, in that moment, everything was justified. Everything made sense. Isabella remained discreetly present. She never completely rebuilt the motherhood she had, but she respected the space that Gabriel and Laura had built. She began to dedicate herself to social projects and found some solace in helping other women not to make the same mistakes. She never got involved with anyone again. It seemed that the true love she had in her life was the one that destroyed her. And so, she chose to carry her regret in silence. The letter she wrote to Tomas was kept in a yellowed envelope, waiting for the right day, which might never come, to be read. Lucas distanced himself from everyone. He moved to another city. He never tried to contact him again. He disappeared from Gabriel's life as if he had never existed. And perhaps this was his most honest way of dealing with what he had caused. Laura and Gabriel eventually decided to live together. There was no wedding or ceremony, but there was a solid foundation of affection, trust, and partnership. And with each passing day, Gabriel looked back on his own story, not with pride, but with awareness. He survived devastation, but not only did he survive, he flourished. Because he knew how to transform pain into learning, betrayal into maturity, loss into a new beginning. If you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to comment on what you thought of this story. Which character touched you the most? Would you have done things differently? Your opinion is important. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because here, every week, we expose the truths behind the appearance of perfect relationships. This story reminds us that betrayal doesn't just destroy marriages. It tears apart bonds, affects children, deconstructs identities, turns love into pain, and leaves scars that time doesn't always heal. Sometimes, the worst pain isn't being betrayed, but looking back and realizing that everything you built was based on lies. So, never forget, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our commitment is to stories that show the real consequences of choices made in the dark. And, above all, to the truth. Because it is only through the truth that something new and true can be born.